Welcome, you're watching Forbidden Talk, a show dedicated to unearthing social taboos facing the Middle Eastern community. This is your platform to challenge prejudice, explore new ideas, give a voice to the unheard, but most of all, offer you unique insight into the different Middle Eastern subcultures now living in the UK. Today's topic, cousins marrying. There's over 1 billion people worldwide living in regions where 20 to 50% of marriages are consanguineous, meaning related by blood, such as first or second cousins. In the Middle East, consanguineous marriage is common and highest in Sudan, closely followed by Qatar and then Yemen and Saudi Arabia. In Britain, first cousin marriages are legal and have been for centuries, but nowadays are most common among migrant communities from Arab countries and are most prominently from Pakistan. But despite being quite a common occurrence, consanguineous marriage is not without its controversy.
Very interesting topic. I am a product of cousin marriage, and there is generations and generations of cousin marriage in my family. I didn't see it, I saw my mother and father love each other. I saw my aunties and uncles love each other. They were all cousins. Currently, if you ask me how I see it, I see it in a modern society that something may be needed to think twice for a number of reasons. With all this now, we are so knowledgeable about health issues, especially when it comes to generations and generations. My father and mother were cousins. My grandparent, one side, they were cousins. My brother married to his cousin. Everybody is fine, thank God, alhamdulillah. But with all that knowledge of what happened when people, same chrome, keep getting married, I get worried about it. Also, it brings a lot of conflict. It happens in my society, it happens into the society of the Middle East. I connected with them, they are my families, my friends. It brings a lot of conflict, because if couple get complicated, the whole extended get complicated and people lose each other in a big way. So within those two reasons, currently from where I stand, I would say no with the modern society. But in the past, it was what it was. Everybody, all the family were related to each other. They used to care each other. I enjoy it. I have so many people that I am so many cousins, and I call it they are cousins of my cousin from my mother's side, and my cousin from my aunt's side, and I enjoy it. But what can we say?
In Britain, first cousin marriages are legal and have been for centuries, but nowadays are most common among migrant communities from Arab countries and most prominently from Pakistan. But despite being quite a common occurrence, consanguineous marriage is not without its controversy. Cousin marriage is drawing increasing stigma as migration has brought significant numbers of people from populations that favour consanguineous marriage to the West, and because a run of negative publicity has highlighted related genetic disorders and children being born with disabilities and learning difficulties. The Doha debate drew further attention to this issue in 2012.
Last week I visited the home of a family. He's a high school teacher, and 3 of his kids, ages 23, 20, and 18, are in diapers, severely mentally retarded, don't recognize their parents. These families send a very clear message. Marry within your community, marry even within your remote family, but do not marry your first cousin.
In our part of the world, you cannot discourage it simply because there are religious and cultural reasons. So in principle, you cannot ask or discourage a Muslim from wanting to do something that is permitted by God. Culturally, the lifestyle here, there's a lot of respect for the family. Families kind of feel comfortable if the daughters marry within the family rather than marry a stranger with no background. They're not sure whether she's going to be happy, safe and whatnot.
But is cousin marriage a legitimate cause for concern? If not, then why does it attract so much negative attention? But if so, what should be done about it? We took to the streets of London to find out.
In the Catholic religion, by tradition, for almost medical reason, it has been banned because the transfusion of blood in the same family was occasionally causing trouble. But again, if the freedom of people to choose, they can do it, yeah.
No, I don't. Why? Because it's in the same family, isn't it? It's mingled.
Yeah, I think they are. If they are loving each other and like that, they can marry.
There's all sorts of issues with that. I know it's not just cultural. It's biological. It doesn't make sense to reproduce with the same from the same from the people who share the same genes. We're not programmed to do that.
It's their choice of life. If a man looks that his cousin or his cousin is like a love of his life, yeah, he can marry her. If it's not. It's like a freedom. But the most important thing that we are doing in Saudi Arabia now, especially that has been it was a must from our sheikhs and from our religion department. They are pushing or they are given one condition that it must be before having any marriage, that there is a medical examination on the man and the woman. If they are good and they have the good quality of genes, they can be married. If they're not, they won't.
Consanguineous marriage has not always been such a taboo subject. Charles Darwin famously married his cousin Emma and went on to have 10 children. Queen Victoria also married her cousin Prince Albert, along with many of the royal family at that time. However, as medical advancements were made, a connection between inherited birth disorders and cousin marriage came to light, causing it to be shunned by many. Earlier, I spoke to Mandy Sanghera, Diversity and Inclusion Specialist. Mandy, welcome to the show. Well, you've been a human rights activist for 23 years, specialising in disability issues. So what do you make of cousin marriage?
I've obviously been doing this for 23 years, and I've been specialising in forced marriages of vulnerable adults. And actually, when I went back to the families, I realised that actually a lot of the parents were related, and there was a lot of intermarriages from families, and it kind of realised, and when we looked into the genetics, that there was an awful lot of cousin marriages. And that's had the impact on the disability.
And how do you think, in your experience, what you've seen, how do you think cousin marriage can really impact families?
I think it's looking at depending on the person's disability, the impact that it would have on you for caring and looking after somebody with a disability. It's okay if somebody has a very mild learning disability and they can wash and dress themselves, but actually when you've got high complex needs or you've got very severe disabilities, the impact that it has on a parent to be looking after a child who's in a wheelchair, who might need to be wearing incontinent pads, who might need feeding, who might need dressing and has no speech, not able to communicate. I know that verbal communication is only 7% of our communication and 93% is non-verbal, but however, it's parents, it is quite difficult.
So in the communities you've been working in, how common is cousin marriage? And also, in those marriages, the children they've had, how common is it for their children to have problems?
I'm not going to say every person that's had a cousin marriage has had a disabled child, because that's not correct at all. But I found that if somebody's had 3 or 4 children, there might be one that have a mild learning disability. I've come across certain families. For instance, there's a family that I've worked in within London who have got 2 children with quite a severe disability, and actually the parents have got some form of a very mild learning disability, and dad also has mental health issues. So they've got a sort of an element of quite a few things, and it's kind of going down. So it is quite common, and but it's also kind of trying to raise the awareness to families to try and say that, because it's very difficult, because people will say to me, it's a part of our religion and a part of our culture, and I don't want to be knocking anyone's faith or anything, and it's trying to kind of educate people and saying to families, actually looking after somebody, the impact on you, it's incredibly stressful, it's very difficult. You might have to not be able to work because you're caring for a disabled child and that, so it's quite common.
If sort of, the parents, they had learning disabilities because, they were a result of a cousin marriage, then why would somebody then opt for their children to marry their cousins? Are they not aware of the problems associated
It's very, very
with it?
difficult, because it comes back to people's culture, and there's an awful lot of different factors that motivate people to marry a first cousin. It might be that actually they trust that person, they think that person will stay in a marriage, because divorce is very common in all cultures.
So do you think that there's a lack of awareness out there about sort of the risks of, having children with genetic problems? Do you think awareness needs to be raised?
I think it definitely needs to be raised within the communities to sort of start saying, well, actually, look, we understand that in the Quran it says you cannot marry your mum, your sister and your daughter and stepchild or a foster child that you might have looked after. It's very clear in that. So I'm not going to sit here, because I'm very conscious that people can become very Islamic phobic very easily, and I don't want to be doing that and picking on a faith, because it's not just an Islamic problem, because actually it happens in all different communities as well. But it's just about raising the awareness with them to say, actually, look, it is having an impact. Maybe we need to be having blood tests, need to be having a look at, actually, are genes that close up? Are we going to have a child with a disability?
Okay. Well, what you mentioned earlier is people marrying their cousins in the UK alone has been happening for centuries.
Yeah.
So why do you think there's so much stigma surrounding it now? Especially, why do people sort of relate this to Islam?
I mean, you can't, and I've got to be very, very clear about that. But I think because most of the cousin marriages at the moment have been with people from a Muslim background, and I've seen people sort of be very right-wing about certain things and thinking they're draining the National Health Service, they're using services and they're having... But you can't blame people for that, because actually 25 years ago we probably didn't have the sciences or the equipment to prolong a life. So if a child was born with a disability, it would have probably died very young, or it would have died at birth and things. But whereas now we have different facilities. So there's an awful lot of different factors where people are now coming through the system.
But we've been talking about, the risks of having children with genetic problems. But I've been researching this, and actually statistically, a woman over 40 having a child has probably more risk of having a child with problems.
With disabilities as well,
with a cousin. But in England, for me, when I was researching this, I was uncomfortable with the concept of cousins marrying. But if somebody said they were having a child at the age of 40, it wouldn't bother me at all. So why do you think this stigma is around today?
I just think we have certain stereotypes, don't we? So, I'm a woman in my 40s, but, people kind of wouldn't back an eyelid if I was to have a child of just thinking, oh, good for you. We've had people that are in their 60s that have had children, and people have never really sort of said anything. It is just things that I think that we don't know about, or it just seems a bit different to the norm, that we actually kind of be a bit fearful about it. So it's about bringing it back.
And we spoke about how, maybe people marry their cousins, because they want to keep it in the family. Maybe they want to keep wealth in the family. But do you think it's ever a case of sort of immigration issues to sort of bring somebody in?
That's a real big issue anyway. Because in Ireland there's an awful lot of cousin marriages as well. I think people forget that sometimes, that happens in that community. But immigration, yes, there is, because actually one of the things that I do is my speciality is around forced marriages. And 9 out of 10 times people want a carer for the disabled child, so they'll bring somebody that they know, somebody they trust. So that's a real motivating factor. So they'll immigrate a relative over from the Middle East or from Pakistan or from Bangladesh to think, well, actually, do you know what? We need someone to look after our family because we're getting older. We can't look after the disabled child. So we'll bring my brother's daughter over, or I'll bring my sister's daughter over or son over because they can look after. So there's that element of trust. If I talk to families, for disabled children to have a cousin married normally is to get a carer. More often than not, that's the motivating factor. There's a very few that will do it for financial, and then there's a very few that will do it for immigration. Actually, on a great scheme of things, immigration and finances are normally not the factor. It's normally about having a relative come and look after that disabled person normally. And then there's a stigma because actually if you're it sort of removes the stigma of disability. If you were married, then it looks like, oh, you've done the normal thing in society. But that isn't the right thing either, because if you don't know what's happening to you and you don't understand, because marriage is not about wearing a pretty dress and having a party. Marriage is living with somebody 24/7, and it's, you know, being with somebody. And I think it's kind of making sure that the person understands that.
Well, we see in the UK that there is this huge stigma surrounding this issue, but how is cousin marriage seen in other parts of the world?
Do you know, I mean, in the subcontinent, in the Middle East, it's a way of life. So it doesn't have a stigma to it, because actually you don't know any different. That is a part of your daily lives and a way of your culture, and it's the way that you've been brought up. So actually you marrying your first cousin in Pakistan or marrying your cousin in Saudi Arabia, it isn't out of the norm, because that is what you know. So even in the African communities or even in Ireland, but actually somewhere like the West in the USA and things like that, where there is a bit of a taboo, it is sort of frowned upon.
Well, in certain parts of the Middle East, such as Morocco and Jordan, actually the number of cousin marriages is diminishing. Why do you think that could be?
Because people, I think, have realised, looking at the disabilities, looking at the genetics, people are moving on. Many years ago, I think people did it to keep land and keep assets and kind of keep things within the family. And now some of those older people that held those values are no longer around, or they're no longer, you know, families are westernised, family, children have moved out, or they've lived out in different parts of the world, and children don't want to go back and marry somebody back home and things. So I think it's changing, because people might have started off living in the Middle East, but actually they've descended all over the world, and they have kind of met partners of a different faith, or they might have met people you know, in that other country where they might be living. So you might have met somebody that you met in Australia, and you might be from Morocco or Jordan.
Okay. So my last question for you is, how do you think consanguineous marriage should be handled in the future? What do you think needs to be done about it?
It's about raising awareness, and it is. I'm finding that actually now talking to younger people in their 20s and that don't want to be marrying their cousins, I think they've realised when they look at you know, disability or other difficulties of marrying a cousin, people's attitudes are changing, and families are saying to me when I go to them, and they'll say, Mandy, do you know what, I don't want to marry my first cousin, I'd rather marry a second cousin. Still marry somebody that's known to us, because, you know, and that's enriching in itself, because actually people want to hold on to their culture, they want to hold on to what they believe, and I'm not here to do that. But it's just about raising awareness and sort of saying to people, look, if somebody's got capacity and they've got consent and they want to do this, let them do that. As long as they're not hurting anybody, you know, I'm all for, you know, I'm not here to stop anybody, but it's just making sure people understand, you know, the impact on you if you were to marry a cousin.
Oh, Mandy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and good luck for the future with your work.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Forbidden Talk, a documentary talk show exploring social taboos in the Middle Eastern community, only on Levant TV. Well, today we're looking at consanguineous marriage. In reality, all humans are related to some extent, and harmful mutations can arise naturally. And nature has several very good mechanisms for reducing their impact. For example, 50% of women miscarry despite being in peak fertility, owing to genetic abnormalities in the fetus, which are incompatible with life. Furthermore, the vast majority of such abnormalities are recessive and may therefore be passed through several generations before an affected child is born. In fact, the chance of a child inheriting genetic disorders rises from around 2% in the general population to 4% if the parents are cousins. In other words, cousins have a 96% chance of producing a perfectly normal baby. Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Steve Jones from the University College of London and author of several popular science books, including newly released Serpent's Promise. Professor Jones, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh.
Well, there's a lot of different statistics and beliefs, in fact, about cousins marrying and genetic problems that children might have. So can you set the record straight? What are the facts when it comes to this?
Well, the facts, as always in biology, are not always simple. First of all, I think we have to accept the fact that there is an increase in genetic risk in the children of cousins compared to the children of unrelated people. But what's most important is that we put that into the context. We've got to remember that we live across most of the world now in really an unprecedented moment of history where we expect most children to survive until they're adults. And of course, in most of the world, most children do survive until they're adults. And that's completely new. And we see individual childhood deaths, as we should, as great tragedies, which of course they are. Now, what this means is that even a small increase in the chances of illness among children is seen as something awful and terrible. And many people think it's wrong even to suggest that cousin marriages could cause this. But I have to tell you that the information is that it can, but the most important thing is to put it into context and to point out that the effect is often not nearly as big as many people think.
So how much do you think it does sort of increase the risk if people are related and they have children?
It depends on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. For example, in some parts of the world, there are certain inherited illnesses which are relatively common. For example, in great parts of the Middle East and around the Mediterranean, there's an inherited blood disease called thalassemia, which is really not uncommon. I mean, the frequency of the gene, probably as many as 1 person in 10 or more in some places carries a single copy of this gene. Now, if you've got a single copy, it doesn't do any harm at all. But if you marry somebody else who's got a single copy, there's a chance, a 1 in 4 chance actually, that any one of your children will have 2 copies. And that can be very, very damaging. So under those circumstances where these diseases are fairly common, cousin marriage is more of a problem. In somewhere, shall we say, like much of Western Europe, where that particular condition isn't found, the effect is less severe. But again, put it into context. If you look at the patterns of childhood well-being in the Middle East in general, they've enormously improved in the last 50, 100 years, as indeed has been the case in Europe. So the effect is there, but I think we can live with it.
If a couple both had this gene, this recessive gene, will the child definitely have a problem, or is it not definite?
No, it's a bit like spinning a penny. If you've got 1 copy of a particular damaged gene, which is what we call a recessive, it's hidden away, okay, then half your sperm, if you're a male, or half your eggs, if you're a female, will have a copy of that gene. The other half will have the normal version. So every sperm and every egg has got a 1 in 2 chance of carrying a copy of that gene. Now when sperm meets egg, a half times a half, that's 1 in 4 children will have 2 copies of that gene. So for simple recessive hidden away diseases, the chances of any child being affected is 1 in 4, which is quite a high chance. Now it's very important to realise that that chance doesn't change from one child to the next. Many people believe that perhaps they've had a child with 2 copies of a damaged gene, and it's a 1 in 4 chance. So the next 3 children they think will be correct, will be okay. But that's not correct. It's like spinning a penny. The fact that you got a heads first time doesn't mean you're going to get tails the second time. It's always 1 in 4. But of course, most genetic diseases aren't nearly as simple as that, so you can't put straightforward figures onto it.
Are there certain genetic disorders that are more common with cousin marriages? For instance, there's certain disorders that maybe a lot of the population have anyway. I think it is, I've got here in my notes that it's cystic fibrosis, which is carried by 1 in 25 Europeans. So maybe this is common among many people.
Yeah, I think that's a thing, again, something which I think many people don't realise. They tend to think that perhaps somebody has a genetically damaged child in their family with a straightforward genetic condition like cystic fibrosis, which is one of these famous recessives. You need 2 copies of a damaged gene. But there are plenty more. There's the thalassemia I've mentioned. In Africa, there's something called sickle cell, which is very similar. People tend to think, oh, that family's damaged. There's something bad about that family. It's got a damaged gene in it. Everybody watching this program has got probably 2, 3, or possibly even 4 such hidden away genes in their own DNA, about which they know nothing at all. It doesn't do them any harm at all. We're all genetically damaged in our own way. There is a lot, it's an iceberg of genetic damage out there, but we usually don't see that because it's hidden away by normal genes that mask their effects. So the fact that a particular family has got, shall we say, cystic fibrosis, or members of it have got it, doesn't alter the quality of that family in any way compared to any others. We all face the same problem.
Well, just to put it into context, I heard some statistics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that the chances of a consanguineous couple having a child with genetic problems is similar to that of a 40-year-old woman having children. Is that true?
If anything, I would say it's probably the effects of consanguinity, terrible word that, I use it all the time, I still can't pronounce it. The effects of female age on childhood health are probably greater in most places than the effects of marrying a cousin. Because, you know, it's one of the odd things in the modern world, but again, something really quite unusual, is that men and women don't start reproducing at about the age when they're biologically able to do so. It's worth remembering that Romeo and Juliet, in the famous William Shakespeare play, most people think that Juliet was 14 when she fell for Romeo. Now that would nowadays in the Western world be seen, much of the world would be seen as totally unacceptable. The average age for first reproduction in British men and women is a little bit less than 30. Okay, which is that means that people really have already spent half their, women in particular, have already spent half their potential reproductive lives without having any children. And the effect of this delayed reproduction, particularly by women, on the genetic health of children is pretty comparable, at least, to that of cousin marriage. And as the women in particular get older and older towards the end of their fertile lives, maybe their late 30s, early 40s, it probably gets bigger. So I think that's an important thing to put into context. Cousin marriage is only one part of a very complicated equation of about health and sickness of children.
Okay. So my final question for you is, if you had a daughter and she came up to you and said she wanted to marry her cousin, what would your advice to her be?
I would say, go ahead and do it.
You wouldn't have any problem with it?
I would try to explain that there was a slightly increased risk, but I think I put it pretty far down my list of questions about her intended.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to me today.
Pleasure.
Consanguineous marriage remains culturally and socially favoured and respected in many Middle Eastern countries, especially Iran, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. In light of this, many researchers are now putting the emphasis on genetic counselling rather than trying to ban or discourage cousins from marrying. As with many subjects, the key seems to be better awareness of the risks and treatments available. Well, if you have any comments or feedback about today's show, then please email us at forbiddentalk@levant.tv, or you can visit our website levant.tv/forbiddentalk, or find us on Facebook. Thanks for watching. See you next time.